Welcome to the channel. Here, every life we follow leaves a mark. Today we're heading to Seattle, Washington, a gray, rainy city that keeps its secrets very well. We're going to follow Isabel Reese, a 39-year-old architect and mother of twins who spent 2 years without seeing her own daughters after her ex-husband destroyed her in court using forged documents. What Graham didn't know was that the illness of one of the girls would reveal a truth inside a hospital room that he could never control. Stay until the end. If you leave early, you're going to miss the best part. But before we start, make sure you're already part of our family here on the channel, and let us know in the comments which corner of the country or the world you're tuning in from. Let's get started. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in August, when Isabel Reese's phone vibrated on her drafting table where she had slept for less than 3 hours. She was in Portland, Oregon alone in an office that smelled of stale coffee and printer paper with blueprints scattered across every work surface. The Morrison Tower, 6 months of structural calculations, steel specifications, and endless meetings with investors. It all came down to blueprints representing a $2.8 million contract, enough to save the sinking architectural firm she shared with her partner, Marcus Morrison. At 5:00 a.m., she had given up on sleep and returned to her drafting table. Not because she loved the project that much, but because when her mind was working, it stopped thinking about everything else. And everything else in that moment had names Sophie and Ruby, her 10-year-old twin daughters whom she hadn't seen in 732 days. The number on her cell phone had a Seattle area code. She almost didn't answer. Miss Reese. The woman's voice on the other end was calm, carrying that specific urgency that only doctors can maintain simultaneously. This is Dr. Sarah Whitman from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling regarding your daughter, Sophie. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. What happened? Is she hurt? Sophie was admitted to our emergency room early this morning. Her white blood cell count is critically low, 100 cells per microliter. The normal range is between 4,500 and 100,000. We are running additional tests, but we suspect acute myeloid leukemia. The word dropped into the silence of the office like a heavy object. Leukemia. Isabel's 10-year-old daughter had cancer. I need you to come to Seattle immediately, the doctor continued. Sophie is going to need a bone marrow transplant. We need to test you as a potential donor. Time is critical. I'm in Portland. Isabel had already grabbed her keys before finishing the sentence. I can be there in 3 hours. Perfect. Ask for me at the pediatric oncology unit when you arrive. And Miss Reese. A short pause. I know the custody situation is complicated, but right now Sophie needs her mother. Isabel hung up and stared at the Morrison Tower plans scattered across the desk. She called Marcus. I need to cancel the Morrison meeting. Isabel, this is our biggest project in 2 years. If we don't present today, my daughter has cancer. I'm going to Seattle. Silence on the other end. Marcus knew the story. He had watched Isabel fall apart when Graham took the girls away, when the judge believed the lies in that fabricated psychiatric evaluation. He had witnessed every denied appeal, every letter returned unopened. Go, he said. I'll handle Morrison. For those who don't know, Seattle Children's is not just any hospital. It's one of the top pediatric hospitals in the United States, specializing in rare diseases and complex transplants. It serves as a regional hub, treating patients not just from the city but from across the Pacific Northwest. The wait lists are shorter, but the cases are the most severe. The interstate between Portland and Seattle is 210 miles of dark pines and gray asphalt. Isabel made the drive in 2 hours and 40 minutes, pushing 15 miles over the speed limit, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, the radio off. 732 days without seeing her daughters. When Graham won sole custody, he had taken Sophie and Ruby to Seattle, changed their schools, cut off all communication. Isabel sent letters, gifts, birthday cards. They all came back unopened. The judge had believed a psychiatric report signed by a doctor, Martin Strauss, which declared Isabel suffered from bipolar disorder, alcohol dependency, and emotional instability that put the children at risk. None of it was true. But Graham was a charismatic, convincing lawyer, and she was a single mother managing a firm buried in debt. The scales were never balanced from the start. And now Sophie was sick. Isabel had tried to hire lawyers over the past 2 years. 3 had refused the case without even reading the documents. Graham Pierce was a partner at one of Seattle's most respected law firms, and nobody wanted to sit on the opposite side of him in a courtroom. The 4th asked for a retainer she didn't have. She had stopped trying. The hospital parking lot was massive and well lit. The hallways were stark white, smelling of ethyl alcohol and that specific mix of hope and despair that only exists in pediatrics. Isabel followed the signs to the fourth floor. Doctor. Sarah Whitman was at the nurse's station, a woman in her mid-40s, dirty blonde hair pulled into a tight bun with clear, calm eyes. Thank you for coming so quickly. She extended her hand. Let's talk before you see Sophie. The consultation room was small. The doctor closed the door. Sophie was brought in at 300 A.M. by her father. She had been experiencing extreme fatigue, frequent bleeding, and bruising for several weeks. Mr. Pierce thought it was a virus. By the time he brought her in, her count was at dangerous levels. Isabel felt her hands clench. Weeks. The doctor didn't comment, but there was something in her eyes that didn't need words. What matters now is the treatment. Sophie needs a bone marrow transplant. We'll need to test Mr. Pierce and preferably her sister Ruby. Siblings are often the best donor matches. Graham has sole custody, Isabel said, her voice quiet. There's a restraining order. I can't come within 500 feet of the girls. I am aware. But this is a medical emergency. Washington state law allows biological parents access to their children in life-threatening situations, regardless of custody agreements. Does she have the legal right to be here? The doctor paused. Your name is on her chart, as the biological mother. There was a note about blocked contact due to a contested court order. Our legal department gave me the brief before I called you. Does Graham know you called me? Not yet. He left around 6:00 a.m. to pick up Ruby from his sister's house. He should be back in less than an hour. Less than an hour with her daughter before facing him. Can I see her now? Pay attention to this detail. Dr. Whitman called the mother before notifying the father. She read between the lines of the medical chart and chose the right side. The hallway leading to room 412 had colorful murals of elephants and giraffes painted on the walls. Someone at some point had decided that gravely ill children needed smiling giraffes in their line of sight. The intention was good. The result was the kind of forced cheerfulness that only works if you don't think too hard about what's happening behind every door. Isabel pushed the door open slowly. Sophie was lying in the hospital bed looking far too small for the white sheets. Her dark hair had been cut short. Her skin was gray, almost translucent, with dark purple bruises on her arms, where the IV tubes had been inserted. She turned her head toward the door, and Isabel saw fear in her eyes before anything else. It's okay, Isabel whispered, moving slowly. I'm not going to hurt you. Who are you? Her voice was hoarse, weak. Isabel's heart broke in half with surgical precision. My name is Isabel. I'm here to help you get better. Sophie stared for a long moment, those dark eyes scanning her mother's face as if trying to recognize an old dream. And then, so quietly, Isabel almost didn't hear it. Mommy. She couldn't hold back the tears. Yes, baby. It's me. Sophie was quiet for a second. Then Daddy said you left because you didn't want us anymore. This wasn't the time. It wasn't the time to let anger speak louder than love. Isabel sat in the chair next to the bed, took her daughter's cold, small hand between both of hers, and stayed like that without saying a word for a moment. Because sometimes presence is the only thing words can't substitute. I never left, she finally said. I've been trying to come back every single day since they took you away. Before Sophie could answer, Dr. Whitman appeared at the door with an urgent expression. Miss Reese, Mr. Pierce just arrived with Ruby. He is demanding to know why you are here. Isabel waited in the conference room while Graham settled Ruby into Sophie's room. 30 minutes that felt like 30 years. When he walked in, she barely recognized him. 2 years ago, Graham Pierce was the kind of man who wore expensive suits and smiled at judges like he was doing them a favor. Now, at 45, he seemed smaller somehow. His hair had more gray, the lines around his mouth were deeper, but his eyes were the same calculating cold. The eyes of someone who treats people like pieces on a chessboard. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, looking at her like she was something he had accidentally stepped on. What the hell are you doing here? Just between us, this man just walked through a hospital with a gravely ill daughter, and the very first thing he did was pull her mother into a room to intimidate her. Impeccable sense of priorities. Sophie needs a bone marrow transplant, Isabel said with a calm that cost her dearly. Dr. Whitman called me because I'm a potential donor. You have a restraining order. You cannot be within 500 feet of my daughters. Our daughters. And this is a medical emergency. Dr. Whitman walked in before he could answer. Her expression was entirely professional and absolutely unshakable. Mr. Pierce, Miss Reese, is correct. Washington state law guarantees parental access in life-threatening situations regardless of custody orders. Sophie needs a transplant. We need to test all potential donors. That includes both of you and preferably Ruby. Graham looked at the doctor for a second. Then he turned his eyes back to Isabel, flashing that smile she had learned to fear over their years of marriage. Fine, test me. But I want something in return. He paused. If I'm a match and I donate, I want full, permanent custody of both of them. No visitation, no shared agreements. Isabel signs a permanent relinquishment of parental rights. The heir left the room. You can't, Isabel started. I can. His voice was as smooth as broken glass. You want to save Sophie. Those are my conditions. Dr. Whitman went very quiet for a moment. Then, Mr. Pierce, I need to be perfectly clear. What you are describing is medical coercion. If you attempt to use your daughter's life-threatening illness to manipulate custody agreements, I will immediately report you to Child Protective Services and the Ethics Board of this hospital. Do you understand? Let's pause here. In the United States, using a child's medical necessity as a bargaining chip in a custody dispute is considered extortion and constitutes child abuse. It gives a judge immediate grounds to review and potentially revoke custody. Graham knew this. He was a lawyer. He chose to try it anyway. Graham didn't answer the doctor. He just looked at her with those cold eyes and said, I'm not making threats, doctor. I'm protecting my daughters. Then he walked out of the room. Isabel stared at the closed door. Then she said in a low voice, Test me. Test him. Do whatever it takes. Sophie comes first. The tissue typing tests took 20 minutes. Thin needles labeled vials, clinical silence. Graham refused to look at Isabel the entire time. Sophie held her mother's hand. Ruby kept her eyes glued to the floor. Isabel watched Ruby, her heart tightening by the second. 2 years ago, that child had been taken from her at 8 years old. Now she was 10. She was taller, thinner, with shadows under her eyes that no child should have. There was something in the way she moved too cautious, as if she expected to be punished for every gesture. When Ruby finally looked at her, Isabel knelt down to be at eye level. Daddy said you left because you didn't love us, Ruby said. Direct. Without anger. Which was even worse. She wasn't accusing. She was reporting a fact she had accepted as truth. That is not true, Isabel said, her voice steady despite the tears. I love you more than anything in the world. Your father took you away from me, and I never stopped trying to come back. Not for a single day. Ruby stared at her with that desperate need to understand a look that only exists in the eyes of someone who has been lied to for far too long. She opened her mouth to say something when a nurse appeared at the door, calling everyone back for the results. Notice Ruby's shoulders in that moment curved inward like someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. A 10-year-old child isn't born like that. That is learned, and it takes time. 2 hours turned into 4. Isabel sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without being touched. Marcus sent a text, saying the investors for Morrison Tower were threatening to pull their $2.8 million, money that could save their firm. She didn't reply. The coffee stayed right there, cold, untouched, the most honest witness in that cafeteria. At 5:00 p.m., Dr. Whitman called everyone into her office. Graham had arrived with a woman Isabel didn't know, 30-something blonde, flawless, her hand resting on his arm as if claiming mapped territory. Graham introduced her only as Stephanie, no last name, no further explanation. Dr. Whitman ignored her presence with a practiced elegance. I have the preliminary typing results. The doctor looked at Isabel, then at Graham. Isabel, you are not a match. Graham, you are also not a match. The silence grew heavy. What about Ruby? Isabel asked. Ruby is a 50% match for Sophie, which is expected for sisters. The doctor paused, looking at the tablet in her hand with a slightly different focus. However, there is something unusual about Ruby's genetic markers. They do not align with the expected pattern based on Graham's genetic profile. Graham frowned. What does that mean? It means we need to run a more comprehensive genetic panel tonight. There may be additional factors we need to explore before proceeding. She was careful with her word choice. Isabel noticed. Graham noticed too. This detail matters. Because a lawyer doesn't hear unusual markers without starting to calculate. And Isabel saw the calculator turning on in his eyes before he even opened his mouth. He turned slowly and looked at his ex-wife, his eyes narrowing. What did you do, Isabel? I didn't do anything. But her voice faltered because in that moment, for the first time in 10 years, a memory she had buried so deep, she had almost convinced herself it was a fabrication began to surface. June 2015. Dr. Whitman ended the meeting before Graham could press further. She asked everyone to get some rest. Graham left without another word, Stephanie trailing in his shadow as always. Isabel stayed. "Dr. Whitman," she said as soon as the room was empty. "What aren't you telling me?" The doctor closed the office door. "Miss Reese, we need to speak privately. Can you stay after dinner? This might seem like a detail, but it isn't. Heteropaternal superfecundation. 2 eggs released in the same cycle, fertilized by 2 different men within 48 hours. Twins with distinct biological fathers. It's real. It's incredibly rare, 1 in every 400 twin births, and it's almost never discovered unless a DNA test is run for another reason, like searching for a bone marrow donor." It was past 8:00 p.m. when the doctor called Isabel back into the office. The hospital corridors were quiet. Sophie and Ruby were sleeping, monitored by the night shift nurses. It was just the 2 of them, and the truth Isabel wasn't quite ready to hear. The office was small, filled with medical journals and framed diplomas. The doctor gestured for her to sit down and carefully closed the door. "Miss Reese, I expedited the DNA analysis using an emergency protocol allowed under Washington medical law in life-threatening situations." A pause. "The results are complex." Isabel gripped the armrests of her chair. "Can you just give it to me straight?" The doctor turned her monitor toward her. Graphs, numbers, genetic markers, and columns that Isabel didn't know how to read but somehow already understood. First, the good news. The mitochondrial DNA confirms that you are the biological mother of both Sophie and Ruby. There is 0 doubt about that. And the bad news. The doctor met her eyes. Graham Pierce is not the biological father of either girl. The room spun. "That's impossible. Graham and I were together when I got pregnant. We were engaged. I never. There's more." The voice was firm but gentle. "Sophie and Ruby have different biological fathers." Isabel stared at her. "Different fathers, they're twins. They are dizygotic twins, fraternal, not identical. 2 separate eggs, fertilized by sperm from 2 different men." A pause. "There is a rare phenomenon for this. It's called heteropaternal superfecundation." The silence that settled in the room lasted far too long. Isabel closed her eyes, and there it was. June 2015. She and Graham had been fighting for weeks. He wanted her to quit her job at the architecture firm. He wanted to control her schedule, the wedding he had booked, without asking her entire life, as if she were a project he was managing. On a Thursday night, everything exploded. Isabel said she wasn't sure about the wedding. He called her ungrateful and accused her of still being in love with Julian Reed. He wasn't entirely wrong. On Friday, there was a networking gala at the Portland Art Museum. Isabel went without Graham. She needed space. And Julian was there. Julian Reed, the architect, the man she had loved before Graham, the man who had proposed to her 3 years earlier and heard a no because she had chosen her career. Then she met Graham, and Julian vanished from her life. They hadn't spoken in months, but that night, standing in front of a Rothko painting with too much wine and a heavy nostalgia for a life she had chosen not to live, they talked. About work, about choices, about the versions of themselves they had left behind. And Isabel made a mistake that she buried so deep she convinced herself it had never happened. The next morning, she went back to Graham, apologized, and said yes to the wedding. She tried to forget Julian. 2 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. 2 months later, she was married. She had thought the twins were Graham's. She hadn't questioned it. There was no reason to. It made logical sense. She was engaged to Graham. She had gone back to him. The daughters were his. Until now. "Miss Reese," the doctor brought her back. "I know who the other father is," Isabel said quietly. "His name is Julian Reed." The doctor nodded slowly. "We need to contact him. If he is the biological father of one of the girls, he could be a match. Do you have a way to reach him tonight? I haven't spoken to him in 10 years. I understand this is difficult, but Sophie is running out of time." Isabel thought of Sophie, small, pale, her cold hand in hers. She thought of the things she had tried to forget. Then she thought of Julian, the man she had hurt, who had no idea he might have a daughter out in the world. "I'll call him. I try to stay neutral here, but there is something very specific about a man who, upon hearing he might have a child, doesn't ask if it's true, but simply asks when he needs to be there. Keep that detail in mind." The waiting room was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly. Isabel stared at the number on her phone screen for a long time. She had never been able to delete it in 10 years, something she had treated as a weakness. Tonight it felt like something else. She dialed. 1 ring. 2. 3. Hello. His voice was exactly the same. That specific calm of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Julian, she said, her voice cracking before she could continue. It's Isabel. I need your help. There was a long pause. She could hear his breathing. Isabel, is it really you? It is. I'm sorry to call like this. I know it's been years and I have no right to ask you for anything, her voice sank. Something happened. Something terrible, and I didn't know who else to call. Are you okay? Are you hurt? The concern was immediate, genuine. That was Julian. Always putting the other person first, even after everything. I'm not hurt. But Julian. I have twin daughters. They're 10 years old. And one of them, Sophie, has leukemia. She needs a bone marrow transplant. Another longer pause. My God, Isabel, that's awful. But why are you calling me? She closed her eyes. Because the hospital ran DNA tests to find a donor, and they found out something I didn't know. The twins have different biological fathers. It's rare, but it happens. And one of them, she took a deep breath, one of them might be your daughter. From that night, June 2015, the silence that followed was the longest of her life. Julian, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know until today. If I had known. I'm here. His voice was low, stunned but steady. Are you telling me I might have a daughter? And she has leukemia. And I might be a match for the transplant. The doctors say if you're the biological father, there's a 50% chance of being a match. It's much better than looking for an unrelated donor on the registry. Silence. She could almost feel him organizing every piece of information in that methodical way that was always his trademark, piece by piece, without letting anything drop. When do you need me to be there? By Friday for the typing tests, but as soon as… I'm in Seattle, he interrupted gently. I work as an architect up here now. I can be at the hospital tomorrow at 1000 a.m. Isabel felt something thaw inside her chest for the first time in days. Julian, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to. His voice was serene. If she's my daughter, if there is any chance I want to help, I'll see you tomorrow. She hung up and sat in the empty silence of the waiting room, tears rolling down her face without her trying to stop them. Tomorrow, Julian Reed would step back into her life. Tomorrow, she would face the consequences of a night she had tried to forget for a decade. Tomorrow, Graham would discover a truth he had never planned for. But tonight, for the first time since the phone rang at 6:47 a.m., she felt something she had almost forgotten the taste of. Hope. Sophie might have a chance. And sometimes one chance is all you need. By Wednesday morning, Isabel hadn't truly slept in 26 hours. She was in the hospital cafeteria with a coffee that had gone cold for the second time when she saw him walk through the door. Julian Reed, 42 years old. His dark hair had silver threads at the temples that weren't there a decade ago. His shoulders were broader than she remembered. His face was a bit more weathered the way it happens to people who work hard and think even harder. He was wearing jeans and an olive green sweater instead of the tailored suits Graham always favored. And there was something in that simple choice that said everything about the difference between the two men. His hazel eyes found her from across the room, warm, steady, and he walked over without rushing. He sat on the other side of the table as if the 10 years of silence were just an open window he was casually closing. Hi, he said. Neither of them could say anything else for a moment. Are you okay? He asked. 3 words. And Isabel felt her throat close up, because Graham had never been the kind of man to ask that first. Graham walked into rooms demanding answers. Julian walked into rooms checking if everyone was all right. No, she admitted. I'm not. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand for a second. Uncalculated. Unconditional. Tell me everything. So she did. Sophie's leukemia, the DNA test, the revelation of superfecundation, the discovery that Graham wasn't the biological father of either girl, and the night in June 2015 that she had tried to bury forever. She told him without sugarcoating it and without asking for forgiveness after every sentence. Dr. Whitman had been clear Sophie was running out of time and the truth was more urgent than awkwardness. Julian listened without interrupting, without accusing. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Why didn't you tell me when you found out you were pregnant? Because I thought they were Graham's. I went back to him that very same Sunday. 2 months later, we were married. When I realized I was pregnant, it never even crossed my mind that it could be anyone else's. She looked at him. I didn't know this was biologically possible until yesterday. Julian nodded, slowly processing piece by piece exactly as she remembered. So one of them might be mine. Yes. We don't know which one yet. It could be Sophie. It could be Ruby. And the one who is sick is Sophie. Yes. He pushed his chair back and stood up. Then let's get the test. Julian's blood draw took 5 minutes. 1 syringe, 2 vials, labels a freezer. Dr. Whitman explained the protocol expedited human leukocyte antigen HLA, typing with results in up to 8 hours due to the urgency of the case. Julian rolled up his sleeve without hesitation, answered the clinical questions clearly, and when the nurse finished, he thanked her like someone who was raised to believe manners cost nothing. Isabel watched it all from the doorway. There was something in the set of his shoulders, straight calm, that contrasted with everything she had lived through in the past 2 years, of courtrooms, returned letters, and slammed doors. Julian hadn't demanded anything to be there. He had simply arrived. This isn't an accident. The body language of someone who acts by choice is completely different from someone who acts for show. Julian never crossed his arms. Graham had walked into the hospital room the day before with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, the posture of someone defending his territory. Julian had walked into the cafeteria with his hands open on the table, the posture of someone ready to help. At 6:00 p.m., Dr. Whitman called them both back. Isabel and Julian sat side by side. She noticed that they weren't touching, but there was something in the calculated distance between them, both leaning slightly toward the center like 2 magnets that hadn't quite decided what to do yet. The results are in. The doctor opened the file. Julian, you are a 5 out of 10 match for Sophie. That is typical of a parent-child relationship. You are a match for the transplant. Isabel closed her eyes. Julian exhaled slowly. So I'm her father, he said quietly. The DNA confirms it. You are Sophie's biological father. He turned to Isabel. She was crying uncontrollably. Can I meet her? He asked. At 9:00 p.m. The doctor opened the door to room 412. Isabel walked in first. Sophie was awake, a book on her lap, her eyes alert despite her extreme pallor. Sophie, there is someone I want you to meet. Julian walked in slowly, and Isabel watched that rare, unscientific phenomenon happen the exact moment someone recognizes themselves in a face they've never seen before. The expressive eyes, the shape of the nose, the way Sophie smiled out of the corner of her mouth, it all came from Julian so clearly that it was almost impossible she hadn't noticed it for a decade. Hi, Sophie, he said in that gentle voice of his. My name is Julian. Sophie studied him with the specific seriousness of someone who had spent too much time learning not to trust adults easily. Are you my real dad? Julian looked at Isabel. She nodded. I am, he said, his voice thickening. I am. Sophie was quiet for a second. So, are you going to give me your bone marrow? If you let me. It's going to hurt. For me a little bit. For you not at all. They'll let you sleep while it happens. Sophie considered this with the practicality of a child who had already thought about things far scarier than a needle. Okay, she said. And then so quietly it was barely a whisper, thank you. Julian took her hand so small inside his large one, and they stayed like that, talking softly, while Isabel stepped out into the hallway. Because some things deserve space to exist without an audience. Important context. In a bone marrow transplant, the donor has marrow extracted from their pelvic bone under anesthesia. It aches for a few days like a deep bruise. The recipient undergoes high-dose chemotherapy first, then receives the healthy cells intravenously. Recovery takes weeks. The success rate with a half-matched haploidentical donor like a parent has vastly improved in recent years, sitting between 70% and 80%. Thursday morning, Dr. Whitman called Isabel in for a conversation she hadn't anticipated. We need to talk about Ruby. They were in a small third-floor office. The doctor opened her tablet with the care of someone who knows that what they are about to show is going to hurt. We ran a standard pre-donation health screening on Ruby. And Isabel. She paused. Ruby cannot be a donor. Isabel blinked. But you said she's a 50% genetic match. Genetically, yes. Physically, no. The doctor spun the tablet around. Ruby's body mass index is 15.2. For a child her age, the absolute minimum required to guarantee safety under anesthesia and recovery is 16.5. She weighs 60 pounds. The minimum for a pediatric donor is 70 pounds. Her hemoglobin is at 9.8. We need at least a 12. The numbers hit her like spaced-out blows. She's 10 years old, Isabel said. Exactly. Most 10-year-olds weigh significantly more than Ruby. Isabel, these numbers indicate severe malnutrition. The silence that filled the room was colder than before. How long has Ruby been under Graham's sole custody? 2 years. Dr. Whitman set the tablet down. Her expression had shifted. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. There was a firmness in her jaw that signaled something else. We've documented signs of chronic stress during Ruby's admission. Irregularly elevated heart rate, behavioral patterns consistent with prolonged trauma, difficulty trusting adults, withdrawal. A pause. And she weighs 60 pounds. Isabel felt rage and grief collide in her chest like two trains on the same track. Graham had deprived her daughter of food. She hadn't been there to protect her, and he had used that time to hollow out a 10-year-old child from the inside out. What happens now? Her voice came out harsher than she intended. Ruby won't be able to donate. But Julian is a match, and as I said, haploidentical transplant success rates are very good. We have reason to be optimistic. The doctor met her eyes. As for Ruby, what you just heard requires me to file an immediate report with Child Protective Services. Isabel nodded. I know. Do you have a lawyer? Not anymore. You need one. This week, Isabel walked out of the office and went straight into the hallway bathroom. She locked the door, turned on the cold water, and held her hands under it for way too long, staring at her own face in the mirror without really recognizing it. 2 years. Graham had had 2 years with Ruby, and he had used every day of those 2 years methodically calculating exactly how to empty that child out. The hunger, the isolation, the lie repeated every morning that her mother had left because she was bad. 60 pounds. Isabel stayed there until she could breathe again. Then she dried her hands, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the hallway. If there was one thing Graham hadn't calculated, it was that she was still standing. That same day, at 4:00 p.m. Isabel's phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Isabel Reese. It was a female voice sharp as carbon paper. My name is Patricia Lawson. I am a family law attorney. I've been tracking your case for 2 years. If you need help dealing with Graham Pierce, call me. I think we can win. Isabel stared at the phone. How do you know about my case? Because I know that Dr. Martin Strauss lost his medical license in 2022. A year before he wrote the psychiatric evaluation, Graham used to take your daughters. The floor shifted beneath Isabel's feet. Pause here for a second. In the U.S., a psychiatrist whose license is revoked by the state medical board cannot practice or issue legally valid reports. Using a forged or invalid medical document knowingly in a custody case is perjury and fraud upon the court. Graham had presented a judge with an evaluation signed by an unlicensed doctor he had paid to fabricate a fake diagnosis, and nobody had caught it. Isabel's previous overworked attorney hadn't had the resources to investigate it properly, and she had lost her daughters because of it. When can I meet you? Isabel asked. Tomorrow morning. Coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. I'll text you the address. Patricia Lawson was exactly the kind of woman who seemed born knowing that the world tries to push down those without a defense. 50-something charcoal gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and a leather briefcase opened on the table with the organization of someone who doesn't waste time on misplaced papers. Every tab labeled every document in the exact right sequence. The kind of organization that makes opposing counsel sweat. When Isabel approached, Patricia was already standing. Isabel Reese. I've been waiting for you. They sat in the corner booth. Patricia slid a folder across the table before the coffee even arrived. For 6 months, I dug into this case. Here is what I found. She opened the first tab. In 2022, Dr. Strauss had his medical license revoked by the Washington State Medical Commission for unprofessional conduct and fraudulent billing. I have the disciplinary records, the revocation notice, and correspondence proving Graham Pierce paid him under the table. Isabel stared at the documents, her eyes burning. He stole my daughters with a lie. Yes, and we are going to prove it. Patricia flipped to the second tab. We are filing an emergency motion to modify custody on 2 grounds. First, fraud upon the court. The psychiatric evaluation was legally void, and Graham knew it. Second, child abuse. Ruby's medical records from Seattle Children's document severe malnutrition, a pattern of injuries over 18 months, and signs of chronic psychological trauma. He's going to try to destroy me when he finds out. Absolutely. Patricia didn't blink. He's already planning to use the girl's DNA against you. He'll call it paternity fraud. He'll say you deceived him for 10 years. It's going to get ugly. She closed the folder. But we have an answer for that. Julian is showing up to save his daughter's life. Graham was starving his daughter as punishment. A judge will look at both sides, and there will be zero doubt about which one is the monster in this story. At 2:00 p.m., Patricia brought in a private investigator, Frank Bishop. A man in his 50s, with a face weathered like shoe leather, a notepad in his hand and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to everything about Graham, where he worked, how he lived, his habits, his finances, and was blunt. "Give me 3 days. I'll find what he's hiding." At 8:00 p.m., Dr. Whitman called. Isabel Sophie's white blood cell count just dropped to 800. "We can't wait anymore. We need to move the transplant up to tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. Can Julian be here at 7:00 for pre-op?" Isabel looked at Patricia, who was watching with laser focus. "Are we ready?" Isabel asked her. "Can we confirm for tomorrow? This is the final sprint." She hung up. Patricia said quietly, "It's happening now, Isabel. Everything is happening at once." And it was. Sophie's transplant, the custody battle, the investigation into Graham, her architecture firm sinking in Portland, all in the same week. Remember this moment, because it's exactly here when a person has absolutely everything stacked against them at the same time that you find out what they are made of. Isabel stood up and grabbed her coat. Then let it begin. Saturday morning broke with an alarm that wasn't hers. At 6:07 a.m., Sophie's heart monitor flatlined. When Isabel reached room 412, the alarms were echoing down the hallway, and Dr. Whitman was inside barking orders at the code team. "Atropine 0.5 milligram IV push," she said, with the steady authority of someone who has seen this before and refuses to let it be the last time. The nurse pushed the meds. Isabel stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Sophie, looking so tiny beneath the sheets, her chest barely moving. 30 seconds. 1 minute. The monitor beeped. 60 beats per minute. 70. 80. Dr. Whitman exhaled. Severe bradycardia, likely from an electrolyte imbalance. "We'll correct it before surgery. We are still on schedule." She looked at Isabel in the doorway. "Sophie is stable. Julian is prepping. We proceed at 9:00. Isabel nodded. She couldn't speak. At 7:00 a.m., Julian arrived calm and resolute, like someone who had made a decision so solid there was no room left for fear. Before heading into pre-op, he stopped in front of Isabel in the hallway. "I've got her," he said. "I'm not going to let her down." She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say sorry. She wanted to say things that a decade of distance made too complicated for a hospital corridor. She just said, "I know." And it was enough. The bone marrow extraction took 2 hours. Isabel waited in the surgical lounge with her sister Laura, who had arrived the night before and hadn't left her side since. Laura had called on Friday night after seeing a vague update from a mutual friend online. "I'm in the car," she had said. "I'll be there before midnight." She didn't ask permission. She didn't ask if Isabel needed her. She just showed up. That was Laura, the younger sister Isabel had lost touch with during her suffocating marriage to Graham, who had tried calling dozens of times with no answer, and who appeared exactly when needed without standing on ceremony. She didn't say much now. She just held Isabel's hand and brought coffees that went cold on the chairs next to them. At 9:30, Dr. Whitman came out in surgical scrubs. The harvest was perfect. "We got sufficient volume for the transplant. Julian is in recovery. He'll be sore for a few days, but he's fine." A pause. "We've already infused the marrow into Sophie. She's being transferred to the ICU now." Dr. Whitman looked at Isabel with something that went beyond professionalism. "Now comes the hard part. We wait for engraftment. The new cells need to settle into her bones and start producing blood. That takes between 10 to 14 days. If her white count starts climbing, we know it's working. And if it doesn't, we pray that it does." At 11:00 a.m., Isabel walked into the ICU. Sophie was in a narrow bed, tubes running from her arms, a ventilation mask over her face. Her skin was translucent, her hair reduced to wisps, but the monitor beeped steadily. Isabel sat beside her and whispered, "You're going to get better, baby. Julian gave you his strength. Now you just have to hold on." In the U.S. legal system, in severe custody disputes, a guardian ad litem gal is appointed by the court. They don't work for the parents. They work exclusively to represent the best interests of the children. They investigate, interview, and report directly to the judge. When an abusive parent faces a gal and CPS simultaneously, the walls close in very quickly. On Monday morning, Emily Richardson from King County Child Protective Services arrived at the hospital carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of professional serenity of someone who does heavy work and chooses to do it anyway. "Miss Reese, I'm here to conduct a welfare assessment on Ruby," she introduced herself directly. "By law, the interview must be conducted privately. Ruby will have a trained child advocate present. Everything will be recorded." "I understand." Isabel nodded, even though every maternal instinct screamed at her to stay in the room. "She's ready." Emily observed Ruby through the door's window, the little girl sitting on her hospital bed, coloring her movements far too restrained for a 10-year-old. "Let's find out." The interview lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Isabel paced the hallway with Dr. Whitman, checking the clock every 3 minutes, counting her steps back and forth as if physical movement could accelerate time. When Emily walked out, her expression was composed, but there was a shift in her eyes. "Miss Reese, can we speak privately?" In the consultation room, Emily opened her briefcase. "Based on Ruby's statements and the medical evidence, I am officially filing a finding of severe child neglect and psychological abuse." She read slowly, letting the weight of each word land. Ruby described a domestic environment characterized by extreme control, isolation from you and your extended family, and food restriction. She stated that meals were conditional, provided only when she behaved appropriately, which meant not mentioning her mother, not asking to see you, and not crying. Isabel felt her hands trembling on her lap. What was the punishment when she didn't meet those conditions? Her meals were taken away. Emily looked up from the file. "Ruby told me she felt hungry all the time. Even here in the hospital, she said it feels like her stomach forgot how to feel full. This wasn't carelessness. It was a choice. Graham was a lawyer. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to avoid leaving obvious physical marks that a school nurse might catch." "What happens now?" Isabel asked, her voice tight. "I am submitting an emergency report to the King County Family Court today. Based on the medical evidence and Ruby's testimony, I am recommending the immediate removal of Graham Pierce's custody rights and temporary emergency placement with you." Emily closed the briefcase. Ruby corroborated her story perfectly. That matters a great deal to a judge. That afternoon, the emergency motions were filed. The next morning, Judge Harold Bennett issued an emergency protective order. Graham Pierce was barred from any contact with Sophie or Ruby, effective immediately. Temporary custody was transferred to Isabel pending a full evidentiary hearing in 14 days. Patricia called with the news. "You have them back, both of them." Isabel was standing in the fourth-floor hallway when she heard the words. She slid down the wall until she hit the cold linoleum floor, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably while people walked past politely pretending not to look. Some victories arrive exactly like that. Not with fanfare, but with you sitting on a hospital floor, your hands covering your face, finally allowing the relief to outweigh the terror. Later that afternoon, Frank Bishop called Patricia. "I found something. Are you on a secure line?" Patricia put him on speakerphone. Isabel was sitting across from her. Graham set up a GoFundMe page called the Sophie Treatment Fund right after her diagnosis. Frank's raspy voice sounded even heavier over the line. He pushed it through social media, his church network, and his law firm contacts. He raised $475,000. 1, 2, 4, 7 people donated. Isabel froze. How much actually reached the hospital? About $190,000. Patricia closed her eyes for a second. "And the remaining $285,000? Isabel asked, her voice a thin thread. "Disappeared into 3 routes," Frank said, reading the data like an autopsy report. $95,000 was wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under a shell LLC called Pierce Holdings. No employees, no physical address. Another $125,000 was paid as consulting fees to a Dr. Leonard Klein for specialized treatment planning. A pause. That doctor doesn't exist. I ran him through every medical database in the country. A completely fabricated identity. And the final $65,000, Graham paid it directly to himself as administrative fees for running his own daughter's charity fund. None of this was disclosed to the donors. The silence in the room lasted several seconds. Frank Patricia's voice had dropped to a temperature reserved for predators. "Can you document all of this in a formal evidentiary report? Give me 48 hours. It'll be bulletproof." "But there's one more thing," Frank continued. "Graham opened a bank account in Ruby's name 2 years ago, right after he won custody. There's $5,000 sitting in it. Ruby is 10. He used her social security number to open the account so he could hide skimmed cash." Isabel felt her stomach turn violently. Later that evening, she walked into Ruby's hospital room. The girl was sitting cross-legged on the bed, a tablet borrowed from a nurse resting on her lap. When she saw Isabel, she set it aside. "Mom, Daddy showed me a bank account with my name on it once. He said he was saving money for my college. Is that real?" Isabel sat beside her, choosing her words with absolute care. "Your father did some things that weren't right, Ruby. Next week we are going to talk to a judge and show him all the proof. But what matters right now is that you are safe." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "Is he going to come take me back?" Isabel pulled her into a tight hug. "Never again." Ruby rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and Isabel felt the girl's body finally relax, releasing months, maybe years of tension, like a coiled spring that finally found permission to unspool. You know what's ironic about all this? Graham spent 2 years building a narrative that Isabel was unstable, dangerous, and unfit. And in the end, he was the unstable one, embezzling from his daughter's cancer fund, using his 10-year-old's SSN to launder money and fabricating ghost doctors. The difference between them was simple: Isabel was a mother. Graham was a risk manager trying to administer his own impunity. On Tuesday, hospital security alerted Patricia. Graham had been spotted in the main lobby trying to access the pediatric ward. The receptionist had denied him entry. He left before security could confront him. Patricia documented it and notified the Seattle Police Department. On Thursday, he came back. Security cameras caught Graham walking up to the front desk demanding Ruby's room number. The receptionist refused. He escalated. She called security. He bolted before they arrived. 2 violations of a protective order in 72 hours, Patricia said. Every violation just hands us more ammunition. He is burying himself. On Saturday morning, Seattle PD showed up at Graham's luxury condo. He was arrested for violating the restraining order. This time, the judge revoked bail. Graham Pierce would sit in a King County jail cell until his hearing. Stephanie Cole, the woman who had clung to Graham's arm on day 1, sent Patricia a text message 2 days after his arrest. It just said she had ended the relationship, and if they needed anything, they could contact her. Patricia saved the number. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, Isabel and her 2 daughters slept in the same hospital room without Isabel waking up at every noise in the hallway to check if it was him. It wasn't. The custody hearing lasted 2 days. Patricia laid out every piece of evidence with the precision of someone who had spent months assembling a puzzle and finally had the judge's full attention. Dr. Whitman was the first witness. She described Sophie's condition upon arrival: weeks of ignored symptoms, 7 missed calls from the school nurse, 4 canceled pediatric appointments. She described Ruby's condition with a clinical detachment that made the data even more devastating weight, in the lowest percentile for her age, bone density loss, severe vitamin D, and iron deficiencies, hormonal markers consistent with chronic caloric deprivation. Graham's defense attorney tried a weak pivot. Could it not simply be that the child is a picky eater with a small appetite? Between us, this man really stood up in court and presented picky eater as a defense for medically documented bone loss. It takes audacity. Or desperation. Dr. Whitman didn't blink. Children with small appetites do not develop bone density loss or hormonal imbalances. Those are medical markers of deliberate caloric restriction. That is not a body type counselor. That is medical neglect. Emily Richardson from CPS confirmed that Ruby had detailed the environment of control, the conditional meals, the psychological isolation. Dr. Rebecca Klein, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, presented her evaluation. Ruby exhibited symptoms of complex trauma, hypervigilance, and food hoarding behavior in her hospital room. Children who hoard food, she explained calmly, do so because they have learned that their next meal can be taken away at any moment. It is a survival mechanism. It does not develop in a healthy household. Then, Margaret Hoyt, the guardian ad litem, stood up. She didn't work for Patricia, and she didn't work for Graham. She worked for the girls. "Your Honor," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, "I have reviewed the records, interviewed the children, and consulted the medical experts. My recommendation to this court is unequivocal. Sophie and Ruby Reese are not safe under the custody of Mr. Pierce. They never were." Graham's lawyer had nothing to say. $475,000 raised. $190,000 delivered. $285,000 embezzled through a shell company, a fake doctor, an offshore account, and a 10-year-old stolen identity. The defense had no answer for the bank statements. Judge Bennett took off his glasses and stared down at his desk for a moment that felt like it dragged on forever. Then Graham asked to speak. Look at the audacity. After all the evidence, the bank statements, the medical records, the security footage, Graham Pierce decided he could talk his way out of it. He appeared on the courtroom monitor via video link from the county jail. The orange jumpsuit was a jarring contrast for a man used to wearing custom-tailored suits to impress judges. He looked thinner, but his eyes held that same calculated arrogance, convinced he could control any room he was in. "Does Mr. Pierce have a statement?" his lawyer asked the judge. "I do." Graham stared into the camera. "I love my daughters. I made mistakes, but I am Ruby's legal father. I raised her for 10 years. The Constitution protects parental rights. You cannot sever my relationship with her based on allegations." Patricia stood up. "Mr. Pierce." Ruby arrived at the hospital, weighing 60 pounds, suffering from bone loss and severe vitamin deficiencies. "You are a lawyer. You are an intelligent man. Are you seriously claiming to this court that you did not notice your daughter was starving?" Graham's jaw tightened. She was difficult with food. Ruby told Child Protective Services that meals were removed as punishment whenever she mentioned her mother. "Is that what you call being difficult with food?" Silence. "You also repeatedly told Ruby that her mother abandoned her because she was a bad kid. Do you confirm that?" "I was protecting her from the truth." "What truth, Mr. Pierce?" "That her mother tried to contact her over 700 times and you returned every letter unopened. That the psychiatric evaluation you used to rip these children from their mother was signed by a doctor whose license was revoked. Whom? You paid $2,000 under the table." Patricia turned to the judge. "That is fraud upon the court. This man is not a victim. He is the architect of every layer of deceit in this case." Graham opened his mouth. "And the $285,000, Patricia didn't let him breathe. While Ruby starved as a punishment, you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from 1, 2, 4, 7 people who thought they were saving Sophie's life. How do you explain that to the judge?" Graham's silence stretched on. The camera caught the hard set of his jaw, his eyes flashing with a coldness that Isabel had finally realized wasn't just coldness, it was the total absence of remorse. "I have nothing further to state," he finally clipped out. The screen went black. Judge Bennett looked at the lawyers. Then he looked at Isabel. "Court is adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. for the ruling." Isabel walked out of the courthouse on trembling legs. Patricia walked beside her. "We are winning." Isabel didn't say anything. She just looked up at the Seattle sky, that permanent gray that locals eventually stopped noticing, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be the end. Or so she thought, at 10:00 p.m. Patricia's phone rang. It was Stephanie Cole. "I was packing my things at Graham's condo," she said, her voice shaking. "I found something in the basement, behind a stack of old tax files. It was a cardboard box." A pause. "I think you need to see this right now." The next morning, Stephanie walked into Patricia's office carrying the box, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Inside were old medical records, a dusty external hard drive, and 8 empty blister packs of pills. Frank Bishop opened the medical records first. Graham Pierce. April 2014. His voice slowed down like someone reading a bomb schematic, and not quite believing their eyes. Diagnosis: severe oligospermia. Critically low sperm count. Probability of natural conception: less than 15%. Isabel stared at the paper. Graham had known 11 years ago that he was virtually infertile, and more than a year later she had gotten pregnant. Frank plugged in the hard drive. He worked in total silence for 40 minutes. When he finally looked up, he wore the expression of an investigator who just found the absolute worst-case scenario. Recovered search history: May and June 2015. He turned the monitor around. How to sabotage birth control. Fake pills identical to brand name. How to force pregnancy without detection. The air was sucked out of the room. Frank opened a recovered email. Sent from Graham to himself, dated the 10th of June 2015. Order placed. She'll never know. Once she's pregnant, she won't be able to leave. Patricia stood up slowly. Frank printed. He pulled up an Amazon receipt. The 10th of June, 2015. 90 placebo pills. Sugar pills manufactured to look identical to Isabel's prescribed birth control brand, delivered to Graham's office. Stephanie placed the 8 empty blister packs on the conference table in silence. Isabel looked at all of it, the medical records, the search history, the receipt, the empty blister packs, and felt a cold, absolute clarity settle into the space where confusion had lived for 10 years. She had thought the pregnancy was an accident. She had thought her night with Julian had complicated an accident. She had carried the guilt for a decade over something that was never her fault. Graham had planned the pregnancy. He had swapped her birth control for sugar pills. He had calculated that if she were pregnant, she wouldn't leave him. And he calculated right. Because she stayed. She married him. She tried to build a family with a man who had imprisoned her through biological engineering. In the U.S. legal system, reproductive coercion is recognized as a severe form of domestic abuse. It is a violation of bodily autonomy that, when combined with fraud and embezzlement, drastically elevates sentencing guidelines. Graham hadn't just destroyed their marriage. He had destroyed her right to choose before the marriage even began. Patricia called federal agent Nicole Hart that same morning. At 1100 a.m., the new evidence was submitted to the court. Graham's lawyer sat in stunned silence for so long that Judge Bennett had to ask him twice if he had any objections. He didn't. The ruling would proceed the following day, and this time reproductive coercion would be added to the mountain of federal charges. That night, Isabel received a text message she wasn't expecting. It was from her father, Richard Reese. "We saw the news. We are driving up to Seattle. You don't have to see us. We just want to be close." Isabel stared at the screen for a long time. It had been 11 years since she had truly spoken to her parents. Ever since Graham had convinced them she was mentally unstable, that she needed space, and that he knew what was best for the family. And they had believed him. It was an old, deep wound. But they were coming. She replied with one line, "Courthouse." 900 a.m. Thursday morning. Judge Harold Bennett walked into the courtroom carrying a 47-page ruling. He put on his glasses, looked at Isabel, then looked up at the monitor, where Graham appeared for the final time. In the matter of Reese v. Pierce. Having reviewed all testimonies, evidence, and legal arguments, the duty of this family court is not to reward biology. It is to protect children. He turned toward the screen. Graham Pierce is a clear and present danger to his own daughters. He neglected Sophie for weeks as her cancer advanced. He systematically deprived Ruby of food as an instrument of psychological control. He stole $285,000 meant to save his sick child's life. He sabotaged his wife's birth control to force a pregnancy and trap her in a marriage. He used fraudulent medical documents to deceive this court and separate a mother from her children, and he systematically lied to those children for 2 years. A heavy pause. Biology does not erase abuse. Graham's jaw didn't move, but Isabel could see his hands just at the edge of the frame, gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. The grip of a man trying to hold on to control that was already gone. Therefore, I grant full legal and physical custody of Sophie Reese and Ruby Reese to Isabel Reese effective immediately. Graham Pierce's parental rights are fully stripped. He is permanently barred from any contact with the minors. Isabel was crying before the judge even finished his sentence. Behind her in the gallery, her mother Catherine sobbed openly. Her father Richard had his face buried in his hands. Patricia squeezed Isabel's arm. "They're yours. Both of them." 2 hours later, in the federal courthouse downtown, Judge Maria Alvarez handed down the criminal sentence. Patricia had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office to run the hearings back-to-back. It was her way of closing the trap, leaving Graham no room to breathe between one devastating loss and the next. Graham Pierce stood in the federal courtroom, his back to Isabel, his hands cuffed in front of him. His public defender looked like a man who had been handed a sinking ship and simply wrote it down. Graham was convicted of wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, reproductive coercion, child abuse, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Judge Alvarez's voice had that specific gravity of words that don't need volume to cut deep. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. You sabotaged your wife's bodily autonomy to force her into a pregnancy. You exploited a vulnerable child for financial gain. You starved another. You betrayed your wife's trust before the marriage even began, and you made a mockery of the justice system." She opened the file in front of her. Federal sentencing guidelines recommend 18 years. I see absolutely no reason to deviate from that. She looked right at him. You will serve 18 years in federal prison to run concurrently with your state sentences. You will be eligible for parole in 15. Graham opened his mouth to speak. Judge Alvarez cut him off. You will pay $285,000 in full restitution to Sophie's medical fund, $150,000 to Isabel Reese in punitive damages, and $75,000 to the State Victim Compensation Fund. All your available assets will be seized and liquidated to satisfy these debts. A final pause. And your license to practice law is permanently revoked. You will never step foot in a courtroom as an attorney again, Graham finally spoke. His voice had lost all its polished courtroom veneer. I love my daughters. Judge Alvarez stared at him. You stole from a child with cancer. She didn't blink. Love is not the word I would use in your case. Bailiffs take him. Isabel watched as Graham was led out of the courtroom. The measured shuffle of his chained feet, the orange jumpsuit, the shoulders that no longer stood perfectly square. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter, the distinct sensation of a heavy door, locking forever with her standing safely on the outside. At 3:00 p.m., she walked back into Seattle Children's. Sophie and Ruby were in Sophie's room. Sophie was propped up in bed with a book. Ruby was sitting on top of the covers. Both pairs of eyes darted to the door the second she walked in. Isabel sat on the edge of the bed and took both of their hands. The judge said, "You're staying with me. Forever." Ruby's eyes went wide. "Forever, Daddy can't come get me. Never again. You are safe." Ruby buried her face in her mother's shoulder and cried. It wasn't a child's tantrum. It was the kind of crying that comes from holding too much weight for too long and finally finding a place where it's safe to drop it. Sophie reached out and squeezed Isabel's hand tightly. "Mom." Her voice was quiet, but there was more color in her cheeks than there had been in weeks. The spark that leukemia had tried to extinguish was coming back. "Is Julian still my dad?" Isabel looked up. Julian was standing in the doorway watching them with that gentle, steady gaze. "Being a dad is about more than just DNA," Isabel said softly. "Julian wants to be a part of your life, if you want him to be." Sophie looked at him. "Can you come to my next checkup, Julian?" He stepped into the room and sat in the chair next to the bed. "It would be an honor." Ruby lifted her face from Isabel's shoulder and studied him for a moment. Then, with a seriousness far too heavy for a 10-year, "Old, I'm going to call you Uncle Julian. Is that okay?" He smiled. It was one of the few times Isabel had ever seen his eyes well up with tears. More than okay. 6 months later, Dr. Torres walked into the outpatient clinic with the kind of smile that oncologists only let show when they have the best possible news. "Sophie," he said, "you are officially in complete remission. 0 cancer cells detected." Sophie's eyes widened. "So I'm cured. You are doing incredibly well. We will monitor you for 5 years as standard protocol, but your prognosis is excellent." The transplant was a massive success. Isabel felt Julian's hand squeeze hers. Ruby hugged Sophie so hard they almost fell off the examination table. And right there in a standard hospital room with beige walls smelling of ethyl alcohol while the noise of the hallway buzzed outside, something that had been broken for 12 years finally became whole again. Ruby had a long road ahead. The weekly sessions with Dr. Klein continued for months. In one session that Isabel was allowed to observe, Ruby said something that would stay with Isabel forever. "I used to think my dad didn't love me because I was a bad kid. Now I know that he was the broken one." Dr. Klein leaned forward. "And how do you feel about your mom now?" Ruby looked right at Isabel. "Mom is the safest place I know." The nightmares that used to wake Ruby up 5 times a week slowly dropped to once a month, then less. She joined a local soccer team in Portland. She made friends. She learned how to trust again in the right amounts, which is very different from trusting everyone. Isabel's firm survived. Marcus had managed to stall the investors for Morrison Tower long enough. 3 new clients signed on that month, and Julian proposed a merger that resulted in Reese Morrison and Reed Architecture. 12 employees, an annual revenue pushing $5 million, and a company culture built entirely around the simple idea that people who take care of their families make better professionals, not worse ones. Isabel's parents, Richard and Catherine, drove down from Seattle every month. Catherine taught Ruby how to bake chocolate chip cookies in their Portland kitchen. Richard played chess with Sophie and lost with increasing frequency. One evening after the girls had gone to bed, Richard reached out and took Isabel's hand on the couch. "We wasted so much time," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I am not going to waste another day." She hadn't replied immediately. Some things still needed time to heal. But she squeezed his hand back. And sometimes that's exactly how forgiveness starts. Not with a grand speech, but with a squeeze of a hand in the quiet of a living room. Graham had sent 14 letters from federal prison. Isabel read the first 2 and stopped. They said he was in therapy, that he realized his mistakes, that he wanted Ruby to know he missed her. Maybe when they're 18, Isabel told Patricia over the phone. They can decide then. For now, the girls were too busy being happy. And that in itself was enough. On a Sunday in March, Isabel was in the backyard of her new house in Portland, hosting a barbecue. Julian was at the grill. Her parents were there, Marcus and his new girlfriend, her sister Laura, her best friend Vanessa. Everyone who had stayed or come back or arrived when the fog finally lifted. A photographer friend of Laura's suggested a family portrait. It took 40 minutes to get everyone in the right spot. Marcus kept wandering to the edge of the frame. His new girlfriend tried to hide behind Laura. Richard placed his hand on the wrong shoulder 3 times before someone gently redirected him. Real families are like that. Even the official photos are a mess. All right, everybody together, real smiles. Isabel stood in the center. One arm wrapped around Sophie, the other around Ruby. Julian stood just behind Sophie, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The grandparents flanked them. Marcus and Laura squeezed in on the sides. Right before the flash went off, Ruby whispered, "Mom, is this what a happy family looks like?" Isabel kissed the top of her daughter's head. "This is exactly what our family looks like." The camera flashed, and Isabel thought about what she had learned. Not from a textbook or a lecture, but from 732 days without her children. From a disease that almost took everything. From a truth that destroyed a lie and built something unbreakable in its place. Family isn't who is listed on a piece of paper. Family is who shows up. Julian showed up to a hospital without hesitation when a child he didn't even know existed needed him. Ruby learned to call a woman mom again after life had tried to erase her from her memory. Graham had been physically present for 10 years and actively chose cruelty. Biology doesn't explain any of that. Love does. Look at what happened here and hold on to this lesson because it is the most important takeaway from this entire story. The opposite of a toxic family is not loneliness. The opposite of a toxic family is the family you build with the people who choose to stay. There is no magic formula. There is only a daily choice made over and over again. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Isabel lost almost everything, and she rebuilt every single piece, using whatever she had left. Not in one day, not with one grand gesture, but with every small, terrifying choice she made when she was afraid dialing Julian's number, signing the retainer with Patricia standing up in that courtroom when her voice was shaking. That is how your life changes. Not all at once, but one brave choice at a time. What lesson do you take from this story? Look at your own life. Is there someone you are failing to protect because you're afraid of what the confrontation might cost? Is there a truth you keep pushing off for later because the timing never feels right? Isabel waited 2 years. Not out of weakness, but because she didn't have the tools yet. The moment those tools appeared, she used every single one of them. Leave your thoughts down in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. If you haven't joined our family here on the channel yet, now is the perfect time. Every story we tell carries something worth keeping. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.